Perched outside the formidable stone edifice of the Bank of England on Threadneedle Street in London, on the morning of September 15, 1992, one would have witnessed an emblem of absolute stability. For 3 centuries, the old lady of Threadneedle Street had served as the stalwart guardian of the British economy, the very foundation upon which the British Empire was erected. It had provided financial backing for conflicts against figures like Napoleon and Hitler, and managed the currency that once exerted influence over a quarter of the globe. The pound sterling represented more than mere money; it embodied national identity, a symbol of British steadfastness and pride. Yet, behind those imposing stone walls on that somber September morning, apprehension was taking root. The executives in their tailored suits, who managed the bank, harbored a truth unknown to the sightseers outside. They understood that the institution was facing an assault. This wasn't an attack by armed forces or naval fleets, nor were they enduring bombardment by the Luftwaffe. Instead, they were under siege by a power that was imperceptible, silent, and immeasurably more potent than any military, the financial markets. Specifically, they were being targeted by a figure named George Soros. Soros was neither a military leader nor a politician. He was a 62-year-old hedge fund manager operating from an office within a Manhattan skyscraper, some 3,000 miles away. His command was not over tanks, but over capital. During that particular week in 1992, he had concluded that the British Empire's financial stance was a bluff. He perceived the British pound's valuation as deceptive, and he was prepared to wager $10 billion to substantiate his claim. This narrative unfolds Black Wednesday, chronicling the most audacious financial offensive in history. It recounts how a single speculator brought the United Kingdom to its knees, compelling it to relinquish its economic autonomy. It is the story of the day the 19th century clashed with the 20th, and the 20th prevailed. To grasp why a hedge fund manager believed he could destabilize the Bank of England, we must revisit the European political climate of the late 1980s. The Cold War was drawing to a close, the Berlin Wall had fallen, and a pervasive sense of profound optimism permeated the atmosphere. European nations, having spent centuries engaged in mutual conflict, collectively decided that the only viable path to avert future wars was to interlace their economies so inextricably that disentanglement would be impossible. They established a framework known as the Exchange Rate Mechanism, or ERM. The ERM's objective was to foster a zone of monetary consistency across Europe. It served as a precursor to the euro, the unified currency in circulation today. The underlying principle was straightforward. All European currencies were to be interconnected. The French franc, the Italian lira, the Spanish peseta, and the British pound would all be linked to one another. They were designed to fluctuate in harmony, much like ships tethered to a central anchor. That anchor was the German mark. Germany stood as Europe's economic powerhouse. Its central bank, the Bundesbank, was renowned for its fiscal rigor. Germans harbored a deep aversion to inflation, a scarring legacy from the hyperinflationary period of the 1920s, when people required wheelbarrows full of cash to purchase a loaf of bread. Consequently, the Bundesbank consistently upheld the German mark's strength and stability. Other European countries sought to import this stability, aiming to benefit from Germany's financial credibility. Britain formally entered the ERM in October 1990 under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, albeit with her reservations. Her successor, John Major, was a staunch proponent. He was convinced that linking the pound to the German mark would curb the persistent high inflation that had plagued Britain for decades. The British government fixed the exchange rate at 2.95 German marks to 1 British pound. They made a solemn pledge to the global community to defend this rate at all costs. They asserted that the pound would never fall below 2.77 marks, drawing a definitive line in the sand. However, the ERM harbored an inherent flaw. a critical vulnerability that George Soros would ultimately exploit. The system presupposed that all European nations would share identical economic imperatives simultaneously. It assumed that what benefited Germany would equally benefit Britain. By 1992, that assumption had completely unraveled. While the rest of Europe celebrated the collapse of the Berlin Wall, Germany was footing the immense bill for reunification. The integration of West and East Germany proved extraordinarily costly. The German government was compelled to invest billions into rebuilding the crumbling infrastructure of the East. To prevent this vast expenditure from triggering inflation, the German central bank acted as it always did. It increased interest rates. Elevated interest rates act as a damper on economic activity, slowing growth. For Germany in 1992, high interest rates were a perfectly logical measure. Conversely, for Britain, high interest rates spelled disaster. Britain was not experiencing Germany's economic boom, it was mired in a severe recession. Jobs were being shed, homeowners struggled with mortgage payments, and businesses faced bankruptcy. Typically, during a recession, a central bank reduces interest rates to lower borrowing costs and stimulate economic expansion. Britain desperately needed lower interest rates. However, being bound by the ERM, it could not implement such cuts. If Britain were to reduce rates, investors would divest their pounds and acquire marks to capitalize on Germany's superior returns. The pound's value would consequently decline, a scenario explicitly prohibited under ERM regulations. Thus, Britain found itself ensnared within a gilded cage. To retain its place in the European club, the British government was forced to maintain painfully high interest rates, compelling its own populace to endure hardship merely to sustain a wholly artificial currency exchange rate. The British economy cried out for relief, but its political leaders had effectively tied their own hands. Enter George Soros. Soros pursued philosophy before delving into finance. As a boy, he survived the Nazi occupation of Hungary, learning early that figures of authority often mislead, and that seemingly robust systems are frequently fragile. He formulated a concept known as reflexivity. In essence, reflexivity posits that markets are not inherently efficient. Markets are composed of individuals, and individuals are prone to error. Occasionally, markets embrace a narrative that is fundamentally false. When the disparity between this narrative and the underlying reality becomes too pronounced, the entire construct invariably collapses. In the summer of 1992, Soros scrutinized the British pound and identified a substantial chasm between its perceived value and its actual state. The narrative propagated by John Major and the Bank of England suggested the pound was robust, stable, and worth almost 3 German marks. The stark reality was an ailing British economy, with the pound's only support coming from exorbitant interest rates that were actively debilitating the nation. Soros conferred in his quantum fund office with his chief analyst, Stanley Druckenmiller. Druckenmiller possessed an exceptional talent for interpreting macroeconomic trends. He informed Soros that the prevailing situation was untenable, likening Britain's predicament to a person holding their breath underwater. Eventually, they would have to resurface. He predicted that Britain would inevitably be compelled to lower interest rates, and when that occurred, the pound would plummet. The allure of this trade lay in its inherently asymmetric risk-reward profile. If Soros wagered against the pound and his prediction proved incorrect, the worst outcome would be the British government maintaining the pound's stability, resulting in a negligible loss primarily from transaction costs. However, if his analysis was accurate and the pound crashed, he stood to gain an immense fortune. It represented a speculative endeavor with virtually no downside risk and potentially unlimited upside. Yet, Soros was not the sole observer. The broader global financial market was beginning to sense vulnerability. Hedge funds, banks, and currency traders worldwide were scrutinizing the ERM, detecting its emerging weaknesses. The Italian lira was the first currency to show signs of instability. In early September, the lira came under speculative pressure. The Italian central bank expended billions in a futile attempt to defend it, ultimately failing. The lira was subsequently devalued. This event served as the definitive signal Soros had been awaiting. If Italy could succumb, Britain too could fall. The decisive moment arrived on Tuesday, September 15. Helmut Schlesinger, the president of the German Bundesbank, gave an interview to both the Wall Street Journal and a German newspaper. Schlesinger was a strict disciplinarian, weary of propping up weaker currencies like the pound and the lira. In the interview, he exercised caution, but dropped a veiled hint. He suggested that for the ERM to endure, some currencies might necessitate realignment. While he refrained from explicitly mentioning the pound, his implication was universally understood. He was, in effect, signaling that the German central bank would not commit to salvaging the British pound, thereby granting the markets tacit permission to launch an assault. When the news of this interview circulated on the news wires in New York, it was akin to a starting pistol firing. Stanley Druckenmiller entered George Soros' office. He declared Schlesinger's remarks the critical catalyst and proposed augmenting their wager against the pound. At that time, their position amounted to approximately $1.5 billion. Druckenmiller suggested scaling it up to perhaps $3 or $4 billion. Soros looked at him and uttered one of the most famous declarations in financial history. He stated, "If you are right, then you can't be just a little bit right. You have to go for the jugular." Soros instructed him to commit everything, to leverage the entire fund. He commanded him to sell $10 billion worth of sterling. That night, the Quantum Fund engaged in what could only be described as financial warfare. They initiated calls to banks across the globe. They secured loans of British pounds from any institution willing to lend them from British, American, and Japanese banks alike. Immediately thereafter, they converted those borrowed pounds into German marks. The mechanics of a short sale are crucial to grasp here. Soros was borrowing an asset he did not possess, selling it at its current elevated price, anticipating a price collapse, and then intending to repurchase it at a lower price later to return it to the lender. The resulting differential would constitute his profit. By the time dawn broke over London on Wednesday, September 16, Soros and the broader market had amassed a monumental deluge of sell orders. They were liquidating pounds at an unprecedented pace. Inside the British Treasury, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont, was awakened by a phone call. The intelligence was dire. The pound was already depreciating in Asian markets, which had opened hours earlier. The selling pressure was relentless. Lamont, the individual overseeing the British economy, was an astute man, but he found himself in an untenable situation. He proceeded to the Treasury building in Whitehall, where the atmosphere was palpably grim. Officials recognized that this day would present the ultimate trial. They possessed a war chest of foreign currency reserves, valued at approximately $40 billion. Their strategy was to deploy these funds to buy back the pounds that Soros and other speculators were offloading. Their hope was that by acquiring their own currency, they could sustain its value. This tactic had proven effective in the past. Central banks wield considerable power and can typically compel markets into submission, but they had never confronted a market of this magnitude or aggression. At 8:30 in the morning, the London markets commenced trading. The Bank of England immediately intervened. The bank's traders initiated buying pounds in increments of hundreds of millions, vociferously relaying buy orders over phone lines in an attempt to project strength. Ordinarily, when the Bank of England steps in, the market experiences a pause. Traders become cautious, unwilling to directly challenge the government. However, on this particular morning, the market neither paused nor even faltered. For every £1 million the Bank of England purchased, hedge funds sold 2 million. Soros was selling. Other hedge funds were selling. Major corporations such as Ford and BP, observing the pound's rapid decline, began liquidating their own cash reserves to mitigate potential losses. It was a full-blown stampede. The Bank of England was depleting its reserves at an alarming rate. Imagine attempting to stem an incoming tide on a beach with just a bucket. That was the bank's predicament. They were expending British taxpayers' money, billions of pounds of it, effectively transferring it directly into the accounts of George Soros. By 10 o'clock in the morning, it had become unequivocally clear that the intervention was failing. The pound was pinned to the lower limit of the ERM's trading band, hovering just above 2.77 marks. Should it breach this threshold, Britain would be in violation of the treaty. Norman Lamont and the bank officials convened an urgent crisis meeting. They recognized the necessity of escalation. They had to deploy their most potent weapon, interest rates. If currency purchases proved ineffective, they had to render the currency more appealing to hold. Their aim was to elevate interest rates to a level so high that speculators would be enticed to acquire pounds to capitalize on the higher returns. At 10:30 in the morning, the Bank of England announced a dramatic interest rate increase. They raised the base rate from 10% to 12%. A 2% hike in a single day is almost unprecedented. In typical circumstances, such a move would cause the currency to surge. Lamont harbored hopes that this would deliver the decisive blow, forcing Soros to retreat. Yet, the market did not surge. The market scoffed. The traders interpreted the rate hike not as a display of strength, but as an act of desperation. They perceived a government in outright panic. They were acutely aware that the British economy was already fragile. They knew homeowners were already vocal in their distress over 10% mortgage rates. They understood that an increase to 12% would ignite a political revolt. They were convinced the government could not sustain such rates for more than a few days. Consequently, instead of buying pounds, the market intensified its selling. They viewed the rate hike as the last gasp of a dying entity. The pound's price barely registered a change, remaining firmly anchored at the bottom. In New York, George Soros observed the rate hike and allowed himself a smile. He knew he had won. When a government resorts to such extreme measures and the market dismisses them, the contest is unequivocally over. He instructed Druckenmiller to continue selling. Within Downing Street, Prime Minister John Major watched his career rapidly unravel. He was the statesman who had staked his entire reputation on the ERM. He had pledged to the nation that the pound would remain strong. Now, he witnessed the country's wealth hemorrhaging from the treasury into the pockets of speculators. Communication lines between Downing Street, the Treasury, and the Bank of England were constantly busy. They were rapidly running out of viable options and financial resources, having expended billions in a mere few hours. At this juncture, the British government began to resemble the crew of a sinking vessel, desperately jettisoning cargo to stay afloat. They considered suspending trading, even contemplating closing the banks. However, they recognized that such actions would irrevocably tarnish London's standing as a global financial hub. Only one tactic remained: the nuclear option. They resolved to raise interest rates once more. At 2:15 in the afternoon on the very same day, the Bank of England declared a second rate increase. They pushed the rate from 12% to an astonishing 15%. This 15% figure struck terror into the heart of every individual in Britain burdened with a loan or mortgage. If that rate were to persist, it would spell bankruptcy for millions, an act of economic self-destruction. It was a bluff of such immense proportion that the government hoped the market would simply flinch from sheer shock. But the market proved relentless. The traders were fully aware it was a bluff. They knew John Major could not sustain rates at 15% without being ousted from office by his own party. The sell orders continued to pour in. The pound relentlessly depreciated. The game was unequivocally lost. The Bank of England had squandered billions. They had elevated interest rates to absurd levels. And still, the pound continued its free fall. The formidable power of the British Empire had been pitted against the immutable logic of the free market, and the market had emerged victorious. As the afternoon progressed, the exhausted officials within the Treasury reluctantly put down their telephones. There were no further actions to take. They could not purchase any more pounds. They could not increase interest rates further. They had no choice but to concede defeat. The decision was formalized at a meeting held in Admiralty House. John Major, Norman Lamont, and other senior ministers gathered, their mood somber. They collectively agreed to suspend Britain's participation in the ERM. They would allow the pound to float, which implicitly meant they would permit its value to crash. At 7:30 in the evening, Norman Lamont emerged from the Treasury building to face a barrage of cameras. He appeared visibly pale and shaken. He delivered a concise statement announcing Britain's withdrawal from the exchange rate mechanism and the cancellation of the previously enacted interest rate hikes. It was an utter public humiliation. In New York, George Soros and his team ceased trading. They had initiated the day with a substantial short position. As the pound continued to decline in the subsequent days, they repurchased the pounds they owed at a significantly reduced price. The difference represented their profit. When the tumult subsided, George Soros had generated over $1 billion in a single day. He had, almost single-handedly, brought the Bank of England to its knees. However, the narrative of Black Wednesday extends beyond mere financial gains. It signifies a fundamental shift in power dynamics. It marked the moment the world recognized that governments no longer held absolute sway over the financial system. Control had transitioned to the amorphous, electronic collective of traders. This concludes the first part.